Biblical writers primarily use three images when speaking of atonement. They are purity, load-bearing, and payment language. To varying degrees, advocates of penal substitutionary atonement, PSA, rely heavily on these metaphors. However, the logic of many writers does not seem consistent with the Bible's normal way of speaking. So in what follows, I will affirm key ideas espoused by PSA while also demonstrating the flaws in the logic used by many PSA theologians. In the broad swath of literature affirming penal substitutionary atonement, the implicit logic found often looks something like this. Many arguments for PSA depend on two premises. First, the presence of a ransom payment implies that atonement is achieved. Conversely, if there is not atonement, we can assume a ransom has not been paid. Second premise, atonement implies a punishment or retribution of some kind. From these assumptions, these thinkers surmise that the concept of a ransom suggests the existence of some punishment. A persistent concern for PSA theorists is defending God's wrath and the necessity that sin be punished. So this paper explains why parts of that argument are flawed. I'll refute the claim that atonement and ransom implies retribution. Also, I argue that ransom brings atonement and can appease wrath, yet apart from retribution. As a sacrifice, Christ pays our ransom to God, but he does not receive our deserved punishment from God. The first section challenges the second premise of the argument in support of PSA, that is, atonement implies punishment. The Bible contains many examples of atonement without the presence of retribution. Thus, the ransom that brings atonement does not imply retribution. In the context of atonement, payment is not synonymous with punishment. Interpreters often say that Jesus is the sacrifice that pays our debt, receiving the punishment of death that we deserve. They conflate debt and death. However, the biblical writers distinguish between paying a debt and the punishment that comes from one's inability to pay the debt. Therefore, we too should be mindful not to confuse a person's debt with a person's death. That is, ultimate death, the consequence of sin. Below, I will highlight two groups of passages. Together, they demonstrate that ransom cannot be identified as the punishment of sin. Our ransom is not our retribution. First, various biblical texts show that an atonement payment, that is a ransom, makes us avoid punishment. Now, I know some might object that the reason punishment is averted is because the ransom includes death. So, in the second set of passages, we will see that punishment, particularly in the form of death, is not a part of the ransom. First, Exodus 30, verses 11 to 16 clearly distinguishes some sort of compensation payment and the punishment that would otherwise fall on an offender. It also depicts atonement in economic or financial terms. If you look here, I won't read every bit of it, but a census is taken, a ransom is given for the lives of the Lord so that no plague can come upon those being registered. There is a clearly monetary language here talking about the shekel. In this passage, a ransom payment brings atonement. It removes or appeases God's wrath. Verse 12 notes a possible sin, that is, not paying ransom, and its consequence. Without a ransom, punishment would follow. People's lives are at stake. Because of their sin, God threatens a plague. with respect to the atonement, all the typical components are present, namely sin and a threat. In addition, we see a ransom or atonement price. In the passage, paying money is the means of atonement. We can also consider verse 13, verse 15 and 16. This atoning payment saves their lives. Intriguingly, God allows the people to use money to take away his wrath. After all, if they don't pay the required amount, they suffer a plague. It also appears that Numbers applies Exodus 30, verses 15 to 16. Numbers 31, verse 50 says, "And we have brought the Lord's offering, what each of us found, articles of gold, armlets and bracelets, signet rings, earrings, and pendants, to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord." So look here. What brings atonement? Interestingly, it's jewelry. In the second set of texts, we find that atonement does not require people receiving the death penalty as retribution. These include Exodus 21, 32. You see a whole list here. Leviticus 5, Leviticus 10, Numbers 16, and so forth. Outside the Pentateuch, noteworthy passages include 2 Kings 12, Proverbs 6, and Proverbs 13. You see them listed here. I'll elaborate on two of these passages. We begin with Exodus 21, verses 29 to 30. It says, "If the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not restrained it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is imposed for the redemption of the victim's price." Notice that this man deserves death, but people can give payment, that is compensation. This ransom is a monetary payment, not another person's death. Now, to the chagrin of some people, the Mosaic Law did not regard this ransom payment as unjust compensation in this case, despite the owners warranting the death penalty. The Mosaic Law and the idea of a compensatory atonement have no inherent contradiction. Furthermore, incense can appease God's wrath, such as in Numbers 16, verses 44 to 50, which I have here, and I've highlighted the key phrases. In this text, the congregation sins. God, in wrath, is ready to consume them, and even begins to condemn the congregation via a plague. What atones for the people's sin? Well, according to verses 46 to 47, Aaron offers incense, not blood, for a person's life. Apparently, atonement does not inherently require someone to receive a judicial death sentence. Other texts further support the point. Ransom, or payment, is a distinct idea from punishment. I'll give just one example. Jesus tells the story of an unforgiving servant in Matthew 18. Concerning the servant, verse 25 says, "And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. Yet the master shows the man mercy. Sadly, this servant was then ungracious to another man who owed him a smaller debt. So, in verses 34 and 35, Jesus says, "And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Notice the link here. If the man pays his debt, the master will remove the punishment. People often confuse debt and punishment. Therefore, they say, Jesus paid our debt, but their meaning is Jesus paid our death, that is, our punishment. However, they conflate metaphors. Jesus distinguishes three ideas: anger, debt, and punishment. In Jesus' parable, paying the debt removes or alleviates punishment. Notice this metaphorical way of speaking applies even to our relationship with God. Debt precedes punishment. Therefore, paying the debt allays or removes wrath. And as a result, we no longer receive punishment. Popular versions of PSA have several hidden but problematic assumptions. First, people implicitly assume that appeasing God's wrath means that he punishes the sinner. Now, we can test that assumption observing that even where atone connotes appeasement, it does not necessarily imply that someone is punished. I'll elaborate briefly on this point. Theologians often claim that atone implies appeasing wrath, and this is a half-truth. In the following passages, atone indicates entreat or seek favor. The context do not necessarily imply wrath. To entreat the Lord could entail appeasing God's wrath, but not necessarily. Nor do they clearly speak about punishment. In short, appeasing God's wrath implies seeking his favor. However, seeking God's favor does not necessarily imply appeasing his wrath. Observe how the Old Testament interweaves the same narrow set of Hebrew and Greek terms. To see evidence, we'll take a brief dive into the biblical languages. I add the following excursus merely to reinforce the point that we can better understand the concept, such as atonement here, by examining the network of words and ideas that surround it. Compare Zechariah 7:2, which says, "Now the people of Bethel had sent Sharezer and Regem-Melech and his men to entreat the favor of the Lord." Then we read in Zechariah 8, verses 21 and 22, "The inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, 'Come, let us go to entreat the favor of the Lord.'" That's literally seek the face of the Lord. "And to seek the Lord of hosts. I myself am going. Many peoples and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, and to entreat the favor of the Lord." In verse 22, the Greek word again is exklaskamai. However, the corresponding Hebrew word is not kippur, the normal word for atone, but het lamed he, hala. As with exklaskamai, the biblical authors routinely join het lamed he with pane, or for face. Idiomatically, hala and exklaskamai both convey the idea of seeking favor. Accordingly, in Job 11, verse 19, it says, "You will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. Many will court your favor." How does one seek favor? The psalmist writes, "The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people." Likewise, Saul tells Samuel, "I said, 'Now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering.'" In presenting the burnt offering, Saul seeks the Lord's favor. He offers a gift to the Lord to gain atonement. The verb, halah, consistently expresses the desire to please someone, especially in authority, in order to gain acceptance. In international relations, politicians are sensitive to protocols of gift giving that might help them gain favor in the eyes of other leaders. Cubans famously hand out cigars while the French routinely give out wine to diplomats. Some gifts can catch us off guard and make us scratch our heads, such as when Marquis Lafayette provided John Quincy Adams with an alligator. Other presidents can send the wrong signal, such as giving a clock, which symbolizes death in some East Asian cultures. Whatever the effect, the intention is clear and is well understood by people. Gift giving fosters a good relationship. One does not need to be an academic to grasp this main point. A consistent web of terms sheds light on the underlying function of kippur, that is atone. While people seek atonement, they might desire to appease God's wrath, but not necessarily. However, in every case, they entreat the Lord's favor. This point is evident to any reader of the Pentateuch. We see a basic sequence of thought. Whether for moral or non-moral reasons, people become unclean. Therefore, they need atonement. If they don't seek atonement, they remain unclean. Such negligence profanes God and provokes his anger. However, the fact that God threatens to bring punishment on those people does not imply that God is angry with all unclean people prior to their making atonement. Rather, God's anger is reserved for those who neglect or reject his provision for making atonement. Atonement removes whatever obstacle impedes one having a right relationship with another. Intentional sin is not the only thing that destroys friendships. What else gets in the way of fostering good relationships? Lack of awareness, disparities in social status, accidents of the past, misinformation and suspicions inherited from one's family also undermine social harmony. A person can feel neither prejudice nor hatred towards another person, yet feel separation between them. Once that invisible wall becomes visible, however, one is responsible to tear it down. Otherwise, that person effectively approves of its existence. They reinforce the barrier. Steven Adams, previously a center for the Oklahoma City Thunder, learned this lesson in 2016. During the NBA Finals, he said the guards for the Golden State Warriors were, quote, quick little monkeys, end quote. Outrage followed since the Warriors' guards are black and the term monkeys is widely recognized as a racial slur in the United States. Yet Adams is from New Zealand, where the word carries no such connotation. He said, I was just trying to express how difficult it was chasing those guys around. It's just different, mate, Adams told USA Today Sports. Different words, different expressions, and stuff like that. But they obviously can be taken differently, depending on what country you're in. I'm assimilating, mate, still trying to figure out the boundaries, but I definitely overstepped them tonight. Adams intended nothing malicious by his remarks. In fact, he tried to compliment the Warriors on their athleticism. Still, once he discovered his comments caused offense, he quickly sought to apologize and rectify the problem. Although he had no ill motive, he needed to set things right. Atonement refers to the biblical process of making things right. It is how people seek God's favor. A second and fatal assumption that underlies popular versions of PSA exists. Many people assume that God must punish every sin. For this reason, they say that atonement includes the appeasing of God's wrath. In other words, since scholars assume God must punish every single sin, they infer that sacrificial offerings secure atonement by enduring God's wrath instead of us. The flawed supposition here is buried in the phrase, every sin. You see, sin comes in two varieties. First, we have sin that God forgives, that God has forgiven. Second, there are sins that are not forgiven. Penal substitutionary atonement theory assumes that God even punishes every sin that is forgiven. At least some proponents of PSA assume that every sin, that God punishes even forgiven sin. Unless God punishes sin, they say, he cannot forgive sin. God only forgives those sins that he punishes. They conclude that any sin that has not been forgiven has already been punished. Sin is forgiven because God punished people's sins in Jesus. Forgiveness necessitates punishment, they say. Whereas PSA says that punishment is the means of God's forgiveness, punishment in fact is the consequence of God not forgiving sin. In a moment, I'll give further support for this conclusion. Finally, it's worth briefly mentioning another latent assumption in traditional views of PSA. Advocates suppose that a perfect sacrifice is needed to atone because it needs to absorb sin. The death of an imperfect being would not suffice. Yet, how do we explain passages like Numbers 25, verses 1 to 23? Phinehas kills the offender, yet this somehow makes atonement for the people of Israel. The problem seems to be this. According to PSA, the man's death should have no effect on whether the congregation's sin is atoned for. He is not a perfect sacrifice. If the people have sinned, the man's death theoretically should not bring about atonement. They themselves deserve judgment. My friend Greg worked in a church for multiple decades, eventually becoming one of the most senior leaders. His tenure in position afforded him a lot of opportunities, including the chance to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from the church. Before his case went to court, he worked tirelessly, but he couldn't gather enough money to repay what he owed. Finally, a judge gave him a long prison sentence with few chances of parole. Greg was separated from his wife and kids. He lost countless friends, but he had gained an orange prison jumpsuit and massive debt. As an inmate, he earned less than $1 per hour at his prison job. The church insisted on full repayment until they received every dime. They would not advocate on his behalf to the judge. A few weeks before Greg's first parole hearing, a family friend offered to pay the balance that Greg still owed his former church. With his debt paid, the church agreed not to stand in Greg's way. He was released from prison and reunited with his family. His family friend generously relieved Greg of a heavy burden, a consequence of several years of sin. How did this burden get lifted? Greg's friend did not take his place in prison. A felony charge was not placed on the friend's permanent record rather than on Greg's. His friend simply paid the debt that had led to the punishment. When that was paid, Greg was free. In my retelling of Greg's story, anyone can understand the metaphorical distinctions I draw. His debt is a burden, but his time in prison is a punishment. Unfortunately, popular theology frequently confuses concepts like payment, penalty, and punishment. For instance, one hears Christ paid our debt, which is then explained as Christ being punished in our place. This way of speaking scrambles biblical imagery. The figure here depicts the relationship between three key terms. The word penalty is ambiguous. It can be understood either as a payment or punishment. The Bible routinely distinguishes payment from punishment. People who cannot pay their debt to God suffer punishment, such as slavery, shame, and death. This basic connection is found throughout the canon. The distinction between payment and punishment is fundamental to Jesus' comments in Matthew 18:25, where he says, "And as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made." Biblical writers readily make use of these metaphors in the Old Testament. God's people are sold into slavery due to sin. Consider Isaiah 50, verse 1. Because of your sins you were sold, and for your transgressions your mother was put away. And Paul uses a similar word picture. He portrays people as slaves to sin. No wonder we find that God's people make payments. They make reparation, fulfilling their debt in order to avoid a plague. For example, in Exodus 30, verse 12. The way biblical writers speak of ransom or restitution payments suggests the need for rethinking our own manner of speaking. Perhaps an additional distinction is needed. If these payments are not punishments, as we've seen, what are they? It seems these payments serve more like penalties than punishment. To use a modern analogy, they appear more akin to fines or restitution payments in contrast to imprisonment or corporal punishment. In that sense, the requisite offerings are penalties, which people are obligated to pay as a result of impurity or sin. If one does not pay the penalty, they will incur punishment. When we distinguish penalty from punishment in this way, one begins to see how Christ acts as a penal substitute, yet without necessarily implying that God the Father punishes Christ the Son. He is a penal substitute, at least in the sense Christ pays the penalty, that is restitution, required as a consequence of sin. In making this payment, he acts as a substitute in our place. As a penal substitute, he appeases God's wrath, and thus the repentant Christ follower no longer warrants punishment. Penal here need not imply that God punishes Christ rather than sinners. I obviously cannot possibly elaborate on this last point without more time. I primarily present my argument on this in Chapter 9 of The Cross in Context, which releases this week. I remember the day finally came when my two friends were getting married. Decorations, welcome guests who were arriving early for a wedding venue. And to the surprise of the groom, an hour had come to pay the rest of the rental fee to the facility manager. My friend thought he had already paid the money. Instead, he had only given a down payment. Now the manager threatened to shut down the wedding. My friend went into full panic mode. knowing he didn't have the money readily available. He insisted that he already paid the full amount, but he didn't have a receipt to prove it. Now he would pay the penalty either for not paying the bill previously or for losing the receipt. While he scrambled to come up with a solution, several groomsmen met with the manager. They pitched in to pay the bill, putting the charge on one of their credit cards. The wedding was saved. My friend had a financial obligation. The consequence, or punishment that is, for not paying the debt was significant. No wedding, public shame, and the loss of funds already spent. However, because the required payment was made, he did not incur the painful consequence that would otherwise follow. This story from my friend's wedding day is an imperfect analogy. Still, it can help us begin to discern how one might distinguish payment, penalty, and punishment in the context of atonement. So, in what sense can we affirm penal substitutionary atonement? I put forth the following 5 affirmations. I affirm Christ's sacrifice affects atonement. 2, Christ bears our sin. Christ's atonement involves a penalty. Christ's atonement involves substitution. Christ's atonement appeases God's wrath. I unpack all these in the book, Cross and Context. Each assertion is a biblical truth. But what I suggest is this. We can affirm each of these statements without claiming that God the Father kills or condemns Christ the Son on the cross, which is held by many who affirm popular views of PSA. In what way is Jesus a substitute? Christ is a substitute. Jesus deserves death. Instead, he dies. Our sinners deserves death, but instead, Jesus dies. Jesus became a curse in place of his people. God's people do not need to suffer the condemnation due to sin. It is not necessary. This is because they are in Christ. Christ perfectly honors the Father, who has no need to punish his Son. Jesus received an unjust condemnation at the cross. In fact, God overturns the verdict through the resurrection. Therefore, those who belong to Christ will not endure future wrath. As one devoted to God, Christ is a substitute that redeems our lives in much the same way that sacrifices redeem Levites, who were substitutes for Israel's firstborn. Christ is a substitute in the sense that he makes the payment we cannot afford. No sacrifice on our part could suffice. Animal sacrifices were mere shadows of the compensation God requires. We not only have robbed God of his honor, we also cannot pay an offering that truly atones for our offense. He perfectly displays God's glory. His life, death, and resurrection substitute for ours. To use a modern analogy, Jesus' sacrifice is a substitute in the same way that a payment is given in exchange for a set of goods or a state of affairs, like a membership, a freedom of a slave, or entrance into a theater. To state this negatively, his payment substitutes for, takes the place of, the punishment otherwise due. In this way, economic metaphors and substitution do not conflict. Just as Christ is the priest and the sacrifice in Hebrews 8-10, so also he is the substitute payer and payment. Furthermore, Christ is a substitute in the same way that the death of the high priest substitutes for the death of the one confined to the city of refuge. He dies instead of us. He is a substitute in the sense that he ultimately takes responsibility for our sin as we could not. If Jesus already pays our debt, then why does Jesus need to receive our punishment from God for us? Answer: he doesn't. Jesus does not need to receive our punishment from God because he already paid our debt. We must not confuse our debt and our punishment, that is death from God's wrath. Our debt leads to death. Sinners suffer this punishment because we cannot pay our debt. However, if that debt could be paid, God would not need to punish us. Our death itself cannot exhaust our debt. Jesus pays the debt that resulted in our enslavement to sin. Therefore, Christ's payment redeems us from our deserved punishment. If we say Christ pays our debt by enduring our punishment, then we confuse concepts. If Jesus already settled our debt, God no longer should punish us. Accordingly, There is no need for Jesus to endure God's punishment for us. If Jesus already paid our debt legally, we should not receive punishment. Otherwise, God would accept our payment yet still punish us. And this is unjust. How do Jesus' death and the death of sinners differ? Well, the function of our deserved death is not equivalent to that of Christ's death. For us, our death is a just consequence for our sin debt. Death is a penalty for sin. Ultimately, only unrepentant sinners suffer the punishment of death in the most ultimate sense. In contrast, Christ's death is a sacrifice of compensation, that is, a payment. This ransom pays the debt we cannot pay. Therefore, it satisfies the demands of God's law. Christ's sacrifice perfectly glorifies God. As a result, God, through Christ, puts his enemies to public shame. At the cross, God condemns two enemies, sin and death.